various needs. Thank you. And filling gaps and needs that I didn't even know existed. So I think that's fantastic. I'm sorry, my phone, I should have turned off. Um, but one of the things, as Ayanna mentioned, is I was there in Indianapolis last September. So I've met some of you, and I've met some of you in other ways. So happy to see some familiar names, although I can't see your faces, on the list. And I'm so sorry. My phone is ringing and I didn't think fast enough to undo that. One of the things that I wanted to talk to you about today, as Ayanna mentioned, is really talking about startup board development and why that's so important and why that's something that is so basic that you need to set up early as a foundation so that moving forward, I think you'll have the successes and you'll be able to achieve the mission and the goals of your organization. So when we first talked about this, Ayanna first talked about this, we were focusing on kind of just board function. And then Ayanna reminded me, we're talking about social enterprise and startup. So I want to talk a little bit about that. Um, just to make sure, can you guys see the slides that I have up, or is it just me seeing them? Is that okay? Ayanna, do you know?
It's just you right now.
Okay, that's fine. And I can certainly email a copy of the slides to Ayanna, who can distribute them to you. So, like I said, I've met some of you last September, and I know I look forward to meeting the rest of you. Hopefully, this September in Kansas City, I will be there as well. And all of you are associated with the church, with in some fashion. So, we're really talking about faith-based social enterprise and how to manage those boards and things like that. Some of you are already a corporate entity in the states that you are organized. So you have that separate corporate for liability purposes. Some of you are currently seeking your 501c3 tax exempt status with the IRS, so you can be exempt and from paying taxes, but also provide for deductibility for any donors that provide contributions to you. I'd like for you to think about kind of your organization as a double-sided coin or double-sided scotch tape, if you will, for all those Pinterest followers in the audience. So think about the first side as being the corporate entity. That's a state entity, and you are a nonprofit organization, or you seek to be. And that's all you are as a corporation at that point. The flip side of the coin is you have to file separately in order to be tax exempt. So think about that as two different pieces as we kind of move along, and think about the requirements that each may have in order to get the kind of goodies you're going to get from becoming a corporation. You're protected from personal liability. From becoming tax exempt, as I said earlier, you're not paying income tax, and contributions to your organization are tax deductible. So we're talking today, and what all of you are done. I've got a short description of some of the activities that all of you are involved in from Ayana. You are working with a faith-based social enterprise, like I just said. So why are you doing that? You're doing that maybe to provide a needed service in your community. You want to find another way to foster the goals of your organization and the mission. You want to administer the spiritual needs of your organization. Maybe you want to build relationships and increase interaction with the community. In large cities as well as smaller cities, the idea is to grow the church, and idea is to provide the ministry and do the outreach work of your church. So my guess is a lot of you are organized for those reasons. So I want to talk a little bit about what that means from a board experience. So before I do that, I want to take a step back. And, we talked about this a little bit for those of you who were there last September. But as a social enterprise, there's three different ways you can really be kind of attached or associated with your church. One is just to be a part of the church. I call that being an integrated auxiliary. You meet the three requirements. You're a public charity. You're affiliated with the church. You get financial support from the church, maybe not all of it, but some of it. So you're really basically another division of the church, maybe like a Sunday school, or maybe like a men's group or a women's group or something like that. So you're really, in terms of kind of work that needs to be done, nothing other than just being a part of it, the division of the church, internal church. The one con in that is you have shared liability. So whatever the division does, the church shares in the liability. Whatever the church does, your organization division will share in the liability. And there's really not a separate entity, so you don't really have a separate board that's formal anyway. You can have an informal board. So I call that kind of the integrated auxiliary that some of you may be. The second way for a social enterprise to be associated with the church is to do what some of you may have chosen to do, to be a completely separate charitable entity. You can be a complete separate entity, kind of form, do the whole thing that an entity would normally do. Again, the double sided coin, become incorporated in your state, and then file for your own 501c3. So completely separate, but do some work together where there's some integration and association between the entity and the church. Um, in this case, it's kind of the opposite of being part of the church, right? Where you have some overlap. In this case, there's no overlap unless you choose to have that overlap. Everybody's responsible for their own costs. Everybody has their own board and control, and there's no sharing of liability because you're own separate entities. Again, you have your own corporate entity. So those are two extremes. And just kind of a little bit of a review for those of you who were there last September, probably. So those are two extremes. One basically keeps it together, one makes it separate. So one of the things that the IRS has recognized is not everybody wants one of the extremes. So about 5 years ago, they came up with a concept to me that's kind of the middle ground. So essentially, it means that the church will form a separate corporate entity for the corporate liability purposes, that's an LLC that the church owns. But for tax purposes, it's disregarded as a separate entity. So that means for tax purposes, the social enterprise, the subsidiary, if you will share in the tax exempt status of the church. So it's a little bit of best of both worlds. So again, it really depends on your situation and your circumstances and comfort level and what your goals are to decide which kind of entity you want to be. So here's
Geetha,
a short summary. Again, I'll send this to Ayanna and she can certainly share that with all of you.
Geetha, I wanted to jump in here just to recap some of the things that you and I talked about as we prepared for this. That some folks have been bringing up. So yes, it's true. Some of your nonprofits are secular nonprofits. They are not faith-based nonprofits. So to say that it's associated with a church is more a way of saying you see this as a ministry. So for you, it is a ministry. Your affiliation with us as MBA is part of your affiliation with the church. So it's not so much church as one building serving one community, but
Yes.
church in a much broader sense of that's the as some folks would say, that's the bag you're coming out of. But it doesn't mean that you operate in the world that way. And so you can still hear all the commentary about the standalone nonprofits as your category, if that belongs to you, as your category of how you're listening. So standalone nonprofits, regardless of your association with a congregation or the much wider church, is sort of how we're framing that.
Absolutely. Thank you for that clarification, Ayana. Yeah, absolutely. These are kind of more, if there was a closer, really tight affiliation with the building church in your community, these are some ways you can do it. But with the NBA as a whole or Disciples of Christ as a whole, there's different ways you can associate, certainly. But I want to point those out to you just so you know that there are those options that are out there, and we maybe have some people in the audience from any one of those situations. And here's the summary of that. Again, you'll get to see that later. But the reality is, really, regardless of which kind of entity that you are, the ones I described, or if you're completely secular and standalone, or you're faith-based and you're very closely affiliated with the church or the church, the reality is, in order to get the corporate goodies of protection from personal liability and the tax goodie of tax exempt status, there are corporate formalities that you, as your organization, will have to follow as an organization. And most of these corporate formalities really relate to the intersection of between the individuals and, in particular, the board. So let's take a quick look at those. One of those corporate formalities are the ones you already do, I'm sure, and basically having a separate bank account for your entity. If you're a standalone 501c3, you are doing that. You probably also have your own EIN. One of the things is, even if you're not completely standalone, it may be a good idea for you to have a separate bank account or a sub account within the church's bank account, or have a separate EIN, which you can do. Some of the other corporate formalities include things like, maintaining separate financial records. You don't have to have separate audits necessarily, but you should have separate financial records and books and records. You should have your own kind of internal, structure that includes kind of industry compliance and corporate policies and whatever management that you might need for your organization, whether it's standalone or not. And certainly kind of a handle on operations. Make sure that you have meetings, your board meetings, you record those minutes, and you keep books and records. and you have, a good functioning board, that's what we're going to talk about. Basically, the bottom line is the entity must be separate from its creators, employees, donors, trustees, in order to remove those board members and founders and donors and creators from personal liability. And also, from the kind of tax perspective, you want to make sure from a financial record keeping that you're not intermingling assets between the individuals involved, your entity, and even any kind of, even the NBA or particular church that you might be affiliated with. Kind of, we call it like, make sure that the entity is not an alter ego for anybody else, but rather its own standalone and always possible a separate entity. Um, so, who's ultimately responsible to make sure that your organizations are doing what we just talked about? So, I love looking at this triangle. My students have it plastered all over their notebooks because I refer back to it so often during the semester. But if you kind of look at this, you see, the beneficiaries of services, your goals, your mission is kind of the ultimate goal. That's what you want to serve. That's what your organization does. And then, kind of, when I think about it, is, then there are directors who are the head and the heart of the organization. And they have board committees that help the directors, get the board, get its work done efficiently. The officers of the board. Then there's kind of the ED or senior management or administrative manager of the entity, whatever you choose to call the head of your entity. And then there's the employees and staff and certainly volunteers. So let's figure out just very quickly where responsibility for what falls with whom, and what the rights and obligations are, and what crosses the line, what maybe doesn't cross the line. We want to make sure that our board knows what they should and can do and what they shouldn't and cannot do. And we'll talk about board education in a little bit. It's a part of your organization's responsibility to make sure that the board is functioning within its scope of authority. So we'll dig deep in a little bit on that. So when we think of directors, we think of, like I said, the directors are the head and heart of the organization. They're independent, which means typically they don't have another connection, or at least a paid connection, to the organization. They're unpaid in their role as directors. They're independent. They may be donors. They may be other friends and, excuse me, other friends of the organization, but independent, so they can make decisions for the greater good of the organization. Now, keep in mind the way the IRS and corporate law, again, to get those goodies, tax and corporate goodies, the way we look at nonprofit is, unlike a for-profit, nonprofits aren't owned by anybody. Nonprofits are there by a state authority, an IRS authority, to provide services for the common good for the general public or a specific group in the general public. So it's not owned by anybody. So you really can't have any particular individual or group of individuals be really focused on getting benefits from the existence of the nonprofit organization. So one of the things we want to talk about is what else? What are the basic rights? The basic rights. Oh, I see. Thank you, Ayanna. You got our screen up. The basic rights. They are a governing body, oversight and governance. So you want to make sure that they have in order to make an informed decision, which is one of their obligations, that they have enough information or can ask for information so they can make those informed decisions. And certainly they have a right to vote at board meetings, unless they're non-voting members that were presidents last year or upcoming people or something. And they have the right to elect officers. Those are really the three kind of rights that they have. And their responsibilities and duties is, again, the key words for me always are to govern and oversee and make informed decisions. It's not about management. Management and board of directors do not go hand in hand. That's left for, almost by definition, management. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. Many of you, depending on what size board you have, will have board committees. Common, obviously, executive committee that can meet, administrative committee, I'm so sorry, finance, governance, ethics, depending on the industry and depending on the work you're doing, you'll have several committees. One thing to remember about committees is they are authorized in a particular scope by the board, and they are given their authority and discretion by the board. They report to the board. No committee can act on behalf of the board or instead of the board without board permission. So one of the things that we've noticed with startup social enterprise boards is a lot of activity goes on at the board. I mean, at the committee level, and the committees forget to go back to the board and say the committees recommend this be approved. A lot of times, committees will say committees approve this, so we're done. So we have to be really careful that based on fiduciary obligations that boards have, you can't take that right away and they can't give it away. It's their obligation as a board member. So we want to make sure committees are functioning within their scope. Then we talk about officers. Um, Oops, there we go. One of the things we want to think about officers, first of all, I want to make it very clear, is these are officers of the board. A lot of people, and understandably so, we lawyers try to make it as confusing as possible so we can stay in business. When I talk about officers, I'm talking about officers of the board, not like the chief operating officer who's a paid employee of the organization, or chief accounting officer, or chief information officer. We're not talking about the executive director as an officer. We're talking about the president of the board, the vice president of the board, the treasurer, and the secretary of the board. They too are members of the board selected from the rest of the board to serve in these officer functions, and they are also unpaid. But again, keep in mind, I'm not talking about the employed, quote unquote, officers of the organization. And like everyone else, they need to have access to information in order to carry out the function that they're authorized and given to do. And they, while they don't, because they're board members and they're board officers, they cannot manage the day to day operations. What they can do in their role is provide direction for management. Again, think of the two words, governance and oversight, governance and oversight. So that's really all that the officers do, but they're just a little bit narrow focus on the regular board member. So let's talk about management, the people that are paid to do the work that the organization needs done. So when I talk about management, I typically mean the executive director or other senior manager position or officers like or positions like that in the organization. Now, one thing to remember is that the executive director or whatever whoever the title is for the top person in your paid person in your organization, they report to the board. They are hired by the board, paid by the board, or authorized to be paid by the board. And so they are the one person in the organization that reports to the board. They again have the right to information that they need to have information in order to run the organization. And because they're management, they make and execute the day-to-day decisions. And they also have the obligation to really be the go-between from with the board and then the rest of the staff and employees in the organization. And they are ultimately responsible for supervision of everyone else that's in the organization that is being paid. Um, so when we look at staff, if you have any other employees that are being paid on your organization, some of you may not be there yet if you're starting out. Some of you are probably on the verge of it. And some of you may already have some other staff members. So keep in mind, other staff members report to the executive director or senior manager. They do not report to the board. They report to the executive director. And only the executive director reports directly to the board. Again, they have to have information and access to do the function that they're hired for, and they have the support and program and activities that they need to have. One of the things that is they are, kind of the arms and legs, if you will, of the organization. And finally, let's talk about volunteers. One of the things about volunteers is they're unpaid, goes by definition, unpaid ad hoc community volunteers, and they're overseen by staff. I could do a whole other webinar on management of volunteers. Volunteers are wonderful. On the flip side of that coin, they can be a little potentially dangerous depending on how well they're guided and how well they stay within the scope of the work that they need to be doing. We've had all kinds of examples of volunteers who come in to stuff envelopes, but then go down the hall, run into somebody, and speak on behalf of the organization, but incorrectly or improperly, and not being allocated that right to do so. So there's all kinds of volunteer management tools that are available that we can talk about another time. Their job is to be good role models, be engage, be beneficiaries to the community and other volunteers, and do the work to help, kind of the footwork, the legwork, to do the work that the organization is not adequately staffed to do or wants volunteers in order to spread the word and get the word out. So I like this little chart. Again, I'm kind of a chart person. It may be a little goofy to look at it. Again, think about the board as governance and oversight. So they're the ones who think, they plan, they feel, they consider, they strategize, they oversee, they do all these things. Again, think of the board as the heart and the brains. Think of the management as the ones that are doing, acting, following, moving, effectuating the arms and the legs. They're the ones that are the movers and shakers, and the board is kind of the brains and the heart. So I really think it's important. Feel free to use this slide with your board members if that helps. But it really kind of, to me, it hits home the difference between the roles of what somebody should be doing. Now, as I said earlier, one of the things is, well, how do we tell our board this? What is the board supposed to do and not supposed to do? One of the things I've found in kind of my experience is oftentimes board members who don't understand their role sometimes cross over and come into the role of management, which they shouldn't be doing, or they're so worried about doing anything, they really underrepresent their service and don't function fully in their capacity as they could or should. So, really helping your board understand what their role is and kind of reminding them of that on a regular basis, once a year, every 6 months, serves them well and serves the organization really well. So let's talk a little bit about board function. And please feel free to jump in. And I know um, Ayanna and Danny are helping me screen questions, so I don't have to switch from screen to screen, but please jump in if you have questions. Does anybody have any questions now before we jump into the specifically board issues? Yes.
I have to remember to unmute myself. I am seeing a question. If you happen to be the founder of the organization and serve in the role of CEO, does this change the dynamic in any way? In other words, that person having never been hired by the board.
Yeah.
The board came after they came on. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so that's not uncommon. I mean, that's a really good question. Thank you for asking it. It's a really good question. It happens a lot. It's very common with startups because basically with startups, you think about it, I always think I'm in the dream business. My job is to help other people's dreams come true in the nonprofit segment and in the social enterprise segment. You have a dream, you have a mission, you have a goal, you want to achieve it. So it's not atypical for you, that individual person, to be committed and getting this enterprise off the ground. In Missouri, for example, you're required to have 3 independent board members, in order to be a nonprofit. And most of your states are similar, but some of them may be a little bit different. But so you get 3 board members to come on board, but until you get going and until they get moving, you're still pretty involved because you want to make sure that the mission you're creating this organization for moves forward and it's sustainable and it's going to succeed and be here for a very long time to come. So the IRS recognizes that. By letter of the law, if you are a CEO, if you're being paid, you typically cannot vote as a board member. So the IRS really wants to make sure that no one person has control of money. And money, they want to keep money and control separate. So, which is why the requirement of board members are unpaid, versus if you're a board member who's being paid, or if you're somebody who's an employee, you really shouldn't be on the board as a voting member. But again, there is some understanding that in the beginning, we kind of say best practices are about 3 years. Once the organization's off the ground, we really recommend to our clients and our affiliates to say that's probably a good time for either you to not be an employee anymore, and stay on the board, depending on what's needed, or be an employee but not be a voting member of the board. You can attend board meetings as a CEO or executive director. And don't forget, that role is to be the conduit between the board and the rest of the organization. So you should definitely be attending those meetings anyway. But in terms of being a voting member versus being a paid employee, at some point, it's good practice to start separating that. So as the organization succeeds and goes further, the IRS is not going to come back and say, this is really for the benefit of this handful of people or this person. So we want to make sure we redo that. So again, it's not uncommon. It's a good question because I would imagine a lot of you are doing that or have done that or will need to do that. Same thing with our clients. But like I said, at some point, it's a good thing to extricate those, the pay and the control, the money and the control need to be checked and balanced is really what the IRS looks for.
So I have a follow up to that question and then a separate question. You still want those now?
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
So the follow up to that, so that was a helpful answer, even just for me listening. And the follow up is, so then, what are good ways to transition that separation? If that's how you're running the show now, how do you want to? How do you sort of move yourself to get to a point? What's a reasonable timeline? What's some good process?
That's a great question, a follow-up question as well. So one of the things that we recommend is, we understand, reality is reality. You're trying to do this, and most of you have other jobs, and this is something that you're passionate and compassionate about. So the idea, what we kind of suggest is, as soon as you get a good working board, whether it's three or some states require five, whether it's three or five, again, most likely three. Once you start with a three, I would recommend we start with a three. I'll have a list of best practices in a little bit. Once you get comfortable, start. People think succession planning needs to happen, at a much later date and time, but you should be, as a board member, succession planning constantly, 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 because you want to make sure you're rolling in a good board member. You want to make sure you're doing what you need to do to get the next group of, maybe you need a lawyer at some point, so you want to work on that. Same kind of thing with an executive director or a board member. You want to make sure that maybe at the first year you say, okay, I've got this really good board member, maybe we can kind of train that board member to take over for me as the board chair, because I'm also executive director. And that's assuming you decide that you'd rather be executive director than board chair. That's a good way to start saying, bring them into all the committee meetings, really start involving them around that, end of the first year, maybe second year. So hopefully by year three, at the end of year three, they're willing and ready to take on board leadership. And then you can move to a non-voting board, non-voting executive director that sits in on board meetings. If the opposite is true, if you want to stay on the board as the chair of the board, but then you start kind of okay, we're not quite ready. You can act as executive director, but not get paid. And then when you are saying, okay, we need somebody in here who's paid, who's ready to do the full function of executive director, you start the hiring process. Again, we suggest you start it sooner than later, at least by year end of year one. That way you've got year two to kind of get that together. So it's not a drastic do it next week. It's, you want to serve the best opportunities for the organization. So in order to do that, you want to make sure you're doing it carefully. Does that answer your question a little bit?
I'll wait to hear, but I'll hand you the second question while we're talking about that because it's not entirely different. Um, you talked about, and we still got the slide up, the difference between governance and management. It seems there are some decisions that fall on that line in between, and it can be hard to figure out whether a decision needs to be made by the board, approved by the board, or made by the management and done.
Mm-hmm.
Um, one example is a renovation of the space. Is a renovation that's going to cost, let's say, several $1,000s, a governance decision or a management decision?
Wow, that is a great question. And again, that could be a whole other webinar, let me tell you. So one of the things, and some of you have heard me talk about this that were there last September. So I want to practice what I call preventative law. I want to make sure that, to the extent that I can look in a crystal ball and make sure, whatever I can do to prevent trouble from happening later, whether it's discord or financial instability or whatever it is, I want to make sure we prevent that from happening. We want our organizations to focus on the steeple. We want them to focus on the mission, which is right here at that peak, right? In order to do that, we always encourage, startups and social enterprises to lay a really good foundation. Four walls: legal, financial, personnel, and operational. So when I look at it from that perspective, one of the ways from a legal perspective to answer those questions maybe ahead of time is to have those decisions made ahead of time in your bylaws or internal policy documents that you have. What we encourage our clients and nonprofits and social enterprises to do is to have something embedded either in their bylaws or in their policy governance or document or whatever governing document that they have for board meetings, things like that, to have what we call an authority policy. It's really just a paragraph. It basically says, in terms of who has authority to vote on what and who has authority to sign what documents, both on behalf of the organization. So the first step is, it depends on the size of your organization. If you are Washington University and we are a nonprofit, 501(c)(3) educational institution, I'll just say roughly, let's just say $10 million. So making a $5,000 decision has basically a pebble in a river, or a huge pond, or the ocean even. So that decision may be fine with just leaving it to somebody who's the dean of a school or whatever. But when we talk about maybe 5 million, then maybe we need to go a different scale. So I try to adapt what I'm saying to the own scale of your size of your organization. But again, generally with a startup or a social enterprise, what we kind of suggest is to have that paragraph in your bylaws or other governing document that says, for expenditure of up to $1,000, the executive director can do it. Again, $1,000 I'm picking out of thin air. The executive director can make that decision on his or her own. If it goes past, greater than 1,000 but less than 3,000, then the executive director and the treasurer of the organization, or the accountant or the finance head of the organization, needs to make the decision together. If it's more than 5,000, then it goes to executive committee. If it's more than 10,000, then it goes to the board. So it's a question of materiality. What is material to the size of the organization that you have, and what dollar numbers are going to make a huge impact, or an impact, just generally an impact on your organization's future and sustainability. The larger the number gets, the higher up the food chain. And we didn't get a chance to look at the triangle that I had up, but we can go back in a minute. The higher up the food chain, the approval has to be from. So I think if you look at it from that perspective and decide what that dollar value is, that you say, okay, this can be done by the administration and the staff, this goes to executive committee, or this goes to the whole board, you can lay that out on your document so there's no question about it later. One of the other considerations to make is, let's say, for example, the organization wants to enter a lease, but the lease is a $10 lease because somebody's giving you basically a free lease, because you're a charitable organization. And so $10 doesn't hit any scope, right? The executive director can very easily, under the dollar value, make that decision. But this lease will also bind the organization, let's say, to commit to renovation because it's in a blighted area. That's why you got it for $10. Commit you to stay there for 3 years and renovate up to, $10,000 moving forward. So just looking at the $10 value of the lease that you signed isn't going to get you up to the board. But when you start thinking about the long-term 3-year commitment plus, you have to look at really what that means. At that point, that does go to the board. It's a 3-year commitment. It's past 1 year. It binds the organization to maybe $10,000. Again, think of that scope and what it means to you. And it could be more or less. So there are some things that, the staff don't want to bother the board with. And then there are some things that you're better off bothering the board with, because that way for sure that it was an organizational approval rather than kind of a one-off if there's ever an argument about it later.
Mm-hmm. I think thank you for that. I think that's a good principle in general. It's just like, as we look at it out, take the 30,000 foot view, which is what they say boards are supposed to do, right? You take the long view. Is this a long-term decision? Or is this a smaller decision that can be made and the effects of it will be minimal or whatever? One of the other examples that's coming in now as a question is hiring. How much should the board be involved in hiring? By these same principles, or hiring the founder as a CEO, for example, by these same principles, that's a big decision based on how much they're going to be paid.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's also a relevant decision. Well, go ahead. I'll let you talk.
Oh, no, so I'm sorry. So don't forget, one of the things is, when we look at the executive director, I'm sorry, I keep going past the slide. When we look at the executive director, the board does have the right to hire. And the executive director works at the discretion of the board, which is why if you are an executive director first and bring on a board later, which I think was the earlier question, you want to make sure that the people you're bringing on as your board members are behind you, not only in the mission, but behind your work and your approach and values in kind of growing that mission. So the initial board is very important for that reason. But the only hiring that the board is involved with is with the executive director. All other hiring is up to the executive director. That's a management issue. That's not a governance issue. The idea is that the executive director, whether brand new or existing or coming on board 25 years after the organization's been set up, they're really the ones charged with taking that strategic plan, taking that strategy and dream that the board and the vision that the board has, and making that happen, and kind of delegating that work to the rest of the staff and employees. So um, even if even if you're only paying your executive director, I'm not saying only, but if let's say you're paying your executive director $1,000 and that doesn't go past maybe whoever's already the executive director now, if there is one, um, you have to think about it. The executive director is really, the person who carries out the vision of the board. So that has a particular kind of separateness. All other employees, your board should be saying, we're going to allocate that function, and that function really belongs with the executive director. So from a
Okay.
hiring perspective, it's a little bit different. It's not so much, even if you're paying a staff member $1 million, but that staff member reports to your executive director does the hiring. And the only reason the board is going to care about the $1 million is if it's totally clearly out of, kind of normal standard, business standards for that position. If you're paying something totally above and beyond what they would normally get paid or whatever, then you go to the board if it's unusual. But if it's, within the standard hiring process, it goes to the executive director.
Okay. And I think you're going to get to this too a little later as we go on. So I'll let you move on to the board functioning piece. And what
Okay.
doesn't come out. Please feel free, everybody, to keep piping in with your questions. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I tend to go very quickly sometimes, so feel free to stop me. And Ayanna has done a great job of waving her hands and flagging me down. So, um, so I just want to kind of go, we've talked about, I've said oversight and management oversight, and I'm sorry, oversight and, just kind of governance over and over again. One of the things I want to point out and kind of point out in this slide is the board is really one person, one voice. The board only has power as a board, in the united voice of all of the members of the board. It has governing powers coming from that united voice. The individual board members acting by themselves really have no power on behalf of the board. So, as an example, let's say that your board takes a vote and it's a very close vote and it's 5-4. When you leave that room, all 9 of those members have to say, if somebody says, what did the board decide? All 9 of those members have to say the board decided to lease that property on for 3 years. The 4 that objected to that, disagreed with that, can't go out and say, yes, this is what the board decided, but this is what I disagreed with. They have to speak with the voice of the board. Only the board as a single unit has that authority and governing power. And so I just want to make sure our board members remember that, because I think sometimes it's very easy to talk about what happens on an individual basis, because everybody has a different interest in that mission, interest, goal, and they have a different connection to the goal and the board. So we want to make sure that they continue to speak with a united voice. So I'm going to kind of go. Some of you that were there in September have heard of it, and maybe we'll hear it again this September. But the 3 legal duties of board members are duty of loyalty, duty of care, and duty of kind of disclosure and confidentiality. I know those sound contradictory, but you'll see what I mean by that. Duty of loyalty. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's one of the few times lawyers use normal language to talk about something. Basically means your board members have to act in good faith, they avoid conflicts, and if they have an opportunity that they think that the organization may benefit from, they kind of have an obligation to give the first dibs, if you will, to the organization rather than usurping that corporate opportunity for themselves. So that's the duty of loyalty, exactly what it sounds like. Put the organization first. And then we have duty of care. Again, oddly, it sounds exactly like it means. What it means exactly as it sounds. 3 kind of things to think about: be reasonably informed, participate in the decision, and do so in good faith. What that really means is do what ordinary person would do in that same situation. If you're not informed, if your board members aren't informed, they have the right and actually obligation to ask questions and get that information so they can make a reasonable decision and they can be fully informed in that decision. This becomes particularly important when we talk about participating in decisions. The idea there is Don't abstain from every vote just because you don't understand it. Don't be at the board meeting just silently, quietly observing. It's your fiduciary obligation to participate in the decision, to attend meetings, and to vote. The only time you don't vote is if you have a personal interest or financial gain in the vote. Then you abstain. All other times, we should really be encouraging our board members to stay informed, ask questions, and participate in board meetings in good faith. The final one, the final like formal legal duty is duty of disclosure. Basically, this just means that, we have to, anytime any board member comes into information that may be important for the rest of the board to know, that board member has the duty and obligation to disclose that information to the rest of the board. Not every little detail, but something that they would deem to be material, something that would be important to the organization. So tell the rest of the board members something important you learn, that, let's say the board approves leasing this property for a year and building it for 3 years. So let's say you learn that, oh my gosh, I just happened to talk to somebody, at the hairdresser, and the person next to me was saying that there was some toxic waste on that. Clearly, you need to bring that back to the board. Even if you're worried that the sale won't go through, but you really want the lease of the building to happen, whether you agree with it or not, your obligation is to tell the rest of the board members this little tidbit that you've just learned. The flip side really talks about what I was saying earlier. Whatever happens at the board meeting stays at the board meeting. Like Vegas, whatever happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Think of the board meetings the same way. So when I talked about the 5-4 vote, the members who voted against it, the 4 who walk out, they don't say it. They just say this was the board decision. Who voted for, who didn't vote for? Nope, can't disclose it. So that confidentiality has to stay within the board. This becomes particularly important when someone else's right to privacy or freedom, or confidentiality is invoked. So if the board talks about maybe the executive director and their role and their compensation, you certainly don't want to be running around outside the board meeting talking about that as well. Because at that point, not only are you breaching this confidentiality rule, you might be violating that person's right to privacy in terms of what rights they have with their compensation and situation. So I'm going to go through this really quickly. This kind of summarizes, just in kind of normal people words, what board members should be doing: promoting the best interest of the organization, protecting the organization's financial well-being. And I want to kind of take a side here to talk about that. Also includes, protecting is kind of maybe not the right word. It's protecting it, the financial well-being, but that also means participating in the financial well-being of the organization. There is some obligation for the board not only to contribute individually, and we always tell our organizations to ask the board members to contribute. We don't care what it is. We just want it could be $1, it could be $1,000,000, but we want participation from every board member, because as you know, grant foundations and grant makers want to know that your board is somewhat committed. They don't care how much. They just want to know that every board member is given something. So that's something to clarify with your board members, definitely. But as a part of that, I think there's an obligation for friend raising and fundraising to go out and work in development. Now, not all of your board members are going to be good at asking for money, but they are certainly, no matter who they are, I guarantee you, I've yet to meet a board member that at least cannot be a gate opener. To make that introduction, to send the person that is on your board very comfortable with asking money, to make the introduction for that person to walk in, to introduce them to a community that they may be involved in that the organization has no presence in at all. So those kinds of things, when we talk about protecting the financial well-being, we talk about all of those things as well. And certainly some of the other responsibilities that you see: direction from management, again, oversight, governance. And we'll talk a little bit about how they use their experience and skills that they bring to the organization. Um, so let's talk about particularly younger organizations, the startups, the social enterprise, and things like that. Some of the things for you to consider at the kind of stages, and like I said, Ayanna's given me a summary that I'm looking at, your various levels of birth, childhood, toddlerhood, and maybe some of you are in your teen years in terms of your organization. So some of the things that you should consider for, again, best practices, really, some legally required, but best practices as well. Consider the size of your board. And we'll talk about what I would recommend, how you define that. Consider the needs of your board, the experience and skills that your board needs, your organization needs. It's going to be different depending on what you're doing and what your industry is for the work you're doing. Ask about, maybe not ask, but you can get a general feeling of what their friend and fundraising abilities are, interests or skills are. Again, you don't have to be a fundraiser. You could be a fundraiser and a gate opener. Think about prior board experience. This is particularly important for your board chair. It's a good quality to have. Somebody with even one board experience in the past always kind of can bring that experience in leadership on the board. Access and engagement. Are they close by? Are they going to come to meetings? Can you pick up the phone and call and have committee meetings by conference call? Are they engaged? Are they on 17 other boards that they're not going to come to your board meeting? Things like that. Dedication and focus, their passion for your mission. And one of the things I kind of think is very important is stakeholder representation. And what that really means is, on the triangle that your organizations are here to serve the beneficiaries of your services, your community. You are here to serve the mission and the moral values that you are engendering in, the values that you're taking to your community. It's always, I think, important to have some sort of representation, reflection of the community you're serving on your board. Again, I call that they are the stakeholders. The beneficiaries are the stakeholders in your organization. You're a nonprofit, nobody owns it. If anybody owns it, it would be them, if you can qualify that as ownership. So you want to make sure there's some reflection, mirror image of the people that you're serving, the community you're serving on your board as well. Somebody who values stewardship, somebody who's going to say, I'm really going to make this organization fly. I'm really going to make sure this organization is going to be here for the next 10 years, 15 years, 30 years. And somebody who has that ability to do that. And finally, somebody who's going to add to your organizational culture the way it is now, or maybe the way you envision it in 6 months, a year, 5 years, 3 years, things like that. So what does that mean? And I mean, that's the perfect board member I just described, but how do you find that board member, right? Not easy. One of the things we kind of start off with is I ask our startups and social enterprise organizations to say, what are your skills that you really need? What are you looking for? What do you need? One of the few, this is a list of kind of I've compiled based on experience working with clients such as you on what kind of skill sets do a lot of startups and social enterprises look for. Everybody needs a finance expert. You should always have a finance expert. I will tell you that. Human resources expertise. Maybe if you're in education, somebody who has experience in education as a teacher, or if you're in, shelter services and no income, low income shelter services, maybe somebody with some, property management experience, things like that. Legal, I get asked to be on a lot of boards, frankly. I would like to think it's my charming personality, but I think it's my legal experience that they really want. So we get a lot of that. Marketing, especially in terms of kind of tying that together with donor relations and things like that. Fundraising, audience development, education, like I said, access, equality. They may bring demographics in something that's a little different. Again, maybe reflects the stakeholder population a little bit. Somebody who's involved with change management. Let's say your organization has been doing services, on a small scale out of someone's home. And then all of a sudden you say, okay, now we need to go. We need to be bigger. We need more employee. We need more staff. We need more money. We're going to, lease a building and do all this great work. No more in my house or in my basement. You want to look at that as somebody who can come in at that point and manage that change. And for a lot of people who are passionate about nonprofit work and mission work, we don't really look at that as a defined skill, but it is a defined skill. If you look at large for-profit corporations, for example, they have departments and people that are brought in just to affect change if they're doing something a little bit different than what their mission and goal has been before. So those people are out there. So how do you decide what needs you have? What we kind of suggest is consider it first and foremost. Consider your mission statement. Consider what your goals are, your core values, your board culture, the strategic plan if you have one. And I really like to start with those because that's where the passion of the organization lies, and that is what's going to continue the organization's compassion and passion in the delivery of services that you all are doing, and that's what you want to stay true to. because that wouldn't be your mission statement if that wasn't true. Your core values, that's why you're here. So we really want to kind of start with that and say, based on my mission statement, I want to provide, find an innovative um, mechanism for delivering health services to the underserved. So out of that statement comes out innovative. So let's mirror that mission statement or goal into our board. We need innovative people. That tells me that right away. And a delivery of services. Maybe that's a change agent. Maybe that's not. Maybe that's people medical services. Maybe that's a doctor or nurse, somebody that could be have their administrator of a hospital, things like that. So when you say, look at your mission statement, turn those words into adjectives and see how you can reflect that in the composition of your board. And then review your current board. If you would at least have three by now, and see what those skill sets are. What do they have? What do they don't have? What do we need? What's missing? So figure out and assess the skills that you've met. Figure out what skills you still need. And one of the things I'm going to give you a checklist on the next page or two. Um, I would always keep a running list starting as soon as you get off this webinar. Write it down, get on your computer, type it up. Think of potential board members that would be good fits. Maybe you even talk to them. Maybe you don't even know them, but you've heard of them in the community. Write their name down. You never know when they're going to come knock on your door and be interested in your organization. Or you'll never know when another board member can be a gate opener to talk to them and bring them in. So I urge all of you to keep a list of potential board members. And ask them to be, if you do have some connectivity, ask them to be on a committee for 6 months, for a year, to see how passionate they are and how they would fit in. You don't have to ask them to your board right away. And then kind of get a plan on ongoing, like, okay, we know that Geetha Sant is going off the board next year and she's our sole lawyer on the board. We need another lawyer. So let's make sure, out of this ongoing list that we've kept, let's make sure we've got another lawyer that's going to be in kind of on the top of one of the top names on the slate for new members next year. So kind of look ahead. Maybe 1 year is too short. Maybe look ahead 2 to 3 years. Just to make sure you've got somebody in the pipeline to fill the gap you're going to have, whether you have it now or not. So here's a sample tracking sheet. It looks a little overwhelming, but I assure you, after you set this up, you can copy and cut and paste this on your Word document or Excel spreadsheet. After you fill this out, it's pretty easy to upkeep. And I've used it on boards I've sat on or have chaired. I share it with clients to have them work on it. And it's just an idea to keep, kind of an inside track. What's their professional experience? What's their personal skill set? What other kind of board service have they had? Or what else board service do they have now? Many reasons. One, you want some board experience, or maybe you're going to find out they're on a board of a competitive organization, if you will, or something that may not align with the mores or the values of the church or your organization. So you want to get that information. What other community connections do they have that they can bring to your organization? Maybe they belong to a different congregation. Maybe they are a board member at UNICEF or United Way that they can make connections for you, or they bring in all the lawyer groups in the city to come in to do something together. And then I would say start of their first term, end of their first term, so you have it ahead in front of you at all times, when they came on board, when they're leaving, and whether you want them on for a second term or whether they want to come on for a second term. That way you can always keep an eye on who's coming, who's leaving, and follow up. Your leadership or nominating committee can look at this at every meeting they have to continually succession planning again for board members on an ongoing and continuous basis. So just a quick summary of what I've just said. I would urge startups to start with the 3 minimum or the 5 minimum that your state requires. You're welcome to have more, but I would suggest that you don't go past 9 or 11, odd numbers, so there's never a deadlock to begin with. And there's some discussion with legal scholars on what the ultimate size of what the right size board is for organizations. That's a hard question to answer because it depends on your organization. If you're at Washington University with $10 million in endowment or whatever, it's more than that, but I'll just use that number for now. You can have a board of 23 that are going to be all active and coming, and they all are on um, three different committees, and they're doing some robust work. They may not be 23 may not be right for an organization with an operating budget of $50,000, and you're not going to have that many committees. The plus of having a lot of board members is maybe you've got a lot of people who are going to give you great connectivity in the community. Maybe you have large donors that want to be involved, and maybe you have a lot of gate openers and you've got a lot of expertise that you need. That's the plus side, and that's going to be hard to say, oh wow, how do I say no to this person or that person? The negative side is when you get too many cooks in the kitchen that early in the formation of the mission of the organization, there always tends to be some conflict somewhere until you figure out the culture of the organization and you set that tone, whether it's the founder, the executive director, or the board chair. In some cases, based on the question we just got, it's probably the same person playing all three roles. Until you set that tone and foundation and groundwork of what the vision and the dream for this organization is, the bigger you go, the more likely you have some conflict. And the downside also is just from a practical perspective, if you've got 23 people, I can guarantee you not all 23 are going to come to every meeting. And so then you have to deal with quorum issues. Are they there for voting? Are you going to be able to have quorum in order to vote? How do you make sure you keep this person in contact? And then you have issues with board engagement. The quieter person on the board is always going to stay quiet if there's 22 other people in the room and three of them are the one talkers that are talking constantly. So you want to keep that balance. So those are some things to think about. I absolutely urge, and some states require it, not enough. I wish all states required it. Term limits. I think term limits with staggered terms are essential to the organization. And I know that sounds crazy. Why do you have term limits if you want to be sustainable? The idea is you have term limits so you can get rid of a board member if you need to. You've got that written already that our board members are only on board for 3 years, period. And you kind of downplay the fact that it can be renewed. Or, if you have the same voice constantly, you're not getting any progression or forward movement in the organizational kind of structure and growth. People will tell me all the time, well, so and so has the institutional knowledge, they should be on the board forever. That institutional knowledge is very important. So maybe you have that person come back and be on a committee. Maybe you have that person come back and be a non-voting ad hoc member of the board that just sits and listens. Or maybe in some cases, you have them go off for a year or two or three and say that in your bylaws, and they can come back if the board ask them to come back. So there's ways to keep that institutional knowledge without promising it and being stuck with it, if you will, kind of permanently. And staggered terms always make sure that anytime somebody who's been there a while leaves, there's somebody else there that has been there for a while as well. The other key factor is your board chair. The board chair, as I've said over and over again, is the conduit, is the voice and the bridge between the board and the organization and the executive director. Certainly, the board chair sets the tone of the board meetings, but also really is involved with setting the culture of the board, which in many times translates to the culture of the organization. So you want to make sure you've got a strong board chair who can stand up to some of the stronger board members you may have and figure out a way to kind of segue between the two. Board training and board evaluation, in my mind, go hand in hand. Board training, kind of like what we're talking about today, I think is essential. And it's the ED's obligation and the board chair's obligation to make sure there is some board training that happens at least once a year. And every year. So the first time maybe an hour, the second time a year later maybe a 30-minute brush up. But don't forget, you're always getting new board members in and some leaving. So we kind of think that's an important thing. So they can act within the scope of their business and their authority as a board member. The board self-evaluation, while not legally required, we highly recommend it as best practices. It has a twofold function. One, it really enables the board to communicate with the executive director and organization on how they feel about being a board member, and saying, in terms of letting the board chair know that maybe the board meetings are run really well, but the committee meetings aren't, or maybe the committee structure takes too much time. So there's a self-evaluation all board members would do to talk about ways that could improve the board and improve their service to the board. which is the second really good point. We have found, and over many years, board self evaluations really help that board member that may not be stepping up to the plate as much as well as they need to be, or overstepping their bounds. We will give them, kind of like open ended questions. How do you feel about your commitment and engagement to the board? How do you feel about the time that you're spending and the value that you're bringing? So the well-serving ones are going to say, "Oh yeah, I feel great." The ones that are, hopefully somebody's going to go, "Gee, that's a good question. I really haven't been engaged with the board or with this organization. I've missed so many meetings, and really I haven't been stepping up to the plate on these things. So maybe I'm going to do that moving forward." It helps with that introspection and service of the board a little bit as well. Um, I would recommend, most of the bylaws we draft have a scope of authority in their documents in terms of what officer does what, but also kind of what we talked about before, who has the right to authorize spending X dollars or Y dollars, or signing X document or Y document. That's always important. And finally, we just want to make sure that they or checks and balances, and everyone really keeps the mission up front to fulfill those missions. So I'm going to end. I'm going to answer questions. You guys you're not looking at me. I can't see you, but I'm sure if I could see your faces, you're like, "Oh my God, this crazy woman's putting so much ahead of us, in front of us." I assure you, the hardest step is the first step. And the best way to do it, we just need to stop talking about it. One of my favorite quotes, I tell this to my students all the time: stop talking about it and start doing it. And it'll get easier. Some of you are in a good place. Some of you hope to be in a better place. But jump in, look at those charts that I just put up there, and get started. It'll get a lot easier. I'm happy to answer questions and just have a general conversation to whatever extent or level you guys want.
Thanks, Geetha, so much. As you said, the floor is open, the group chat is open. And Danny and I will be working to make sure that we hear your questions and get those back to Geetha. Actually, wanted to talk, just to kick it off, wanted to come back to something you said earlier that we didn't get into, and that was succession planning. Is there anything you can say to sort of introduce this topic for those of us for whom it's new, or for those who know that might be something we need to think about?
That's so succession planning is kind of a loaded term, and kind of in the HR industry, and certainly in corporate America, we really think of succession planning as, oh yes, the president of the company has indicated that he or she is going to retire in 5 years, or oh wow, the executive director of our organization is 62. We're not supposed to talk about ages, but we do. And my guess is, this is board chatter, right? My guess is, she's probably not going to want to stay much longer than 2 years more or whatever. So that's kind of what I call really reactive succession planning, and that's not a good place to do succession planning. It's kind of, when's the best time to plan an exit strategy for a tornado? I mean, I live in the Midwest. We get a lot of tornado alarms and drills all the time. It's not during a tornado. You can't plan, oh, wow, okay, what's my exit strategy? What door, where do I go, under my desk or under my window or whatever, during a tornado? You're better off planning when the tornado is not happening. I use that same theory with succession planning. Succession planning should happen constantly and consistently for a couple of different reasons. One, you can't predict what happens to any one individual, whether you're looking at it from an executive director position, or let's say it's the finance, treasurer for the organization. And not to be so morose, but at any given time, you could get hit by a bus. You don't know what's going to happen. Or that person could have a family emergency and have to move out of state. You never know what's going to happen. So there's always, it's the board's duty to look at that big picture, that vision, that governance, and strategy, to say, okay, we should know that somebody is being groomed from a internal way. So maybe it's a financial officer, internal, the paid finance manager has somebody that's working with them, whether they're in payroll or something else, that we know can step up in an emergency. And that emergency could be just for 1 month when the finance manager needs to have knee surgery, or it could be long term, the finance manager moves to Alaska. So it could be long term or short term, but it behooves well for the organization to always have a plan B for any one of those key important positions within the organization. So that's, start doing it now. You never know. Again, plan for it before the tornado hits. Other way, in terms of board, I really think it's important to have kind of succession planning for board chair, but board members as well. Kind of keep track of that chart that I sent, because you never know when all of a sudden the person that you rely on to help you with all the finance issues on your board moves to Alaska or has knee surgery, whatever. You want to make sure that there's somebody on that list that you can say, hey, can you come on our finance committee? Maybe you're not ready to be on the board, but can you please come to our committee? So that kind of like I said, it's preventative law the way I look at it. It's preventive board governance the way I'm describing it to you, I think. It should be constant and consistent. Does that make sense?
And I'll say this for this and for anything else that we talked about today. If you have templates for those or samples, that would be
Yeah.
great.
So for the board, I would start with the template I threw up there, that chart that I threw up there. And I think you can extract it from the PDF if you, or the PowerPoint. If you can't, I'll send both versions to Ayanna. Um, I would do that. And I think it's, and I can send you a chart for internal management as well. And it counts. It's sometimes it's a little uncomfortable for people because they don't want to think of the worst case scenario. It's like drafting your will. I'm a lawyer and I hate it. I hate it. And I put it off forever. I had children who were in their teens before I did my will because it was just something I didn't want to do. But you have to do it. It's preventative care, right? It's the same thing. You have to, as sad as it may be to imagine your executive director getting hit by a bus or moving to Alaska, that's something that's your fiduciary obligation to, as a board member, to look at that possibility and prepare for it. At least prepare for it, prepare to answer the issue, and have it in foresight. So I'll send a document that will talk about here's your executive director. We really, maybe rough age category, not a specific age, but an age range, uh, and maybe some things that they might have said. And maybe that's a document that just the chair and the executive committee keeps an eye on. Because again, the right to privacy of one individual, trumps the right for information of the board. So that's one thing you got to keep in mind. So maybe that's just something that's privately kept by the board chair or maybe the executive committee. Um, and certainly with key employees like a finance manager, healthcare facility, maybe the doctor, and or the nurse practitioner or whatever. So those are kind of things to keep an eye on and work with the executive director to make sure those positions, there's somebody at least in the interim to fill if something happens.
That's helpful. Thank you. We had another couple questions come in. So the
Okay.
first is, would you recommend a startup task force who will begin to help design and plan and implement some events and programs to introduce the organization, have them serve for a limited amount of time, say 12 to 16 months, and then turn things over to a formal organization, almost like a launch group, and then you pass it off to what would then be the permanent group?
Absolutely. I think that's a fantastic idea. Some of our clients have done that. The hard time that they've had is actually getting the people to commit the time to do it. But if you can do that, if you can find people that you trust that are qualified, and think of them as kind of the change agent that we talked about earlier. They're the change agent from nothing to something fabulous. So a task force like that is a prudent idea and a very good workable idea. Um, a lot of for-profit startups do that. They actually have they have the founders, but then they have a whole launch program that they use. You know what? I'm going to make a note to myself to see if we can talk about some of the launch that we've helped for-profit startups with. See if I can adapt that for you use.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you. Um, and then we have a different question as you make that note.
Yeah.
Is there a way to create an LLC for an organization that's a coalition of 2 to 3 congregations? So, 2 to 3 separate churches, could they create an LLC to be one organization?
So that's a good question. We actually just did that recently for not a member of the NBA, but 3 churches that were so overlapped in their mission and their ministry and their community. Um, and they were both, all 3 were small. And for efficiencies of scale, they they cross over a lot in terms of their outreach. And so for efficiencies of scale, they were kind of co-leasing a van. They were co-leasing a space for not the church aspect of it, but some of the ministries that they worked with. And they found out that they could get insurance for their employees at a much better rate if they worked together, and saving tens of thousands of dollars, which was shocking to me, appalling that they had to pay that much to begin with. But so they wanted to figure out a way to do their own kind of mission, goal work, but somehow come together. So so the three of them becoming one to form an LLC, that's so it wouldn't be an LLC, it would be an umbrella organization. It would be a nonprofit organization. So you would create a nonprofit organization under the state of one of those. I assume they might be in the same state or different states. You would create a nonprofit organization that would get its 501c3, or you'd convert one of them that already has a 501c3 to be kind of the parent, and then change the name and have three churches under that parent organization. Doesn't have to be a church. And that way they can work together, but they can still work a little separately to the extent they follow different paths in their ministry or their work. It can be done. I don't want to get into the legal, nitty gritty of it. It's not exactly straightforward, but absolutely can be done. And like I said, we just did something like that for a group of three churches.
Excellent. Um, Got another comment, not exactly a question, but it says, just want to say the board info has been very helpful. Things I've thought about, but not in such a linear way, and things I haven't thought about at all. So many thanks to you, Geetha, for
Well,
that.
I've been thinking about it, so I'm impressed with that. Thank you. I'm glad we could look at it in a linear way.
And you mentioned before too about when we were talking about with the question about the launch team, the piece about for profit. Well, you have sort of a model that you work with for profit, and you wonder if it could transfer to nonprofit. And that's actually an ongoing question for us through the Incubate initiative. How much of what we can learn from the for profit community is helpful to our folks, to the folks doing health and social service ministry on the nonprofit side.
So so in one of the other classes I teach is, the government and law and nonprofit and in the government. So if we just take a step back, I don't want to bore you with statistics, but if you take a step back on how nonprofits came to be even in the first place, right? So forget about a legal structure, forget about anything related to like reality, but why do nonprofits exist? Why do you guys exist? And nonprofits really started with churches because churches had the access to the communities that they served. They knew what was needed and they filled those gaps. They found the gaps, and churches were the best suited and best able to provide the services that the community needed. And they were trusted to do so because they were the community church. So if you look at it from that perspective, that's where nonprofit started. So at some point, somewhere, we ask the question to our students, so why do nonprofits and NGOs have to do this? Why is the government not picking this up? Why isn't Bill Gates doing it? He's got a lot of money. Why is this left up to nonprofits like you to kind of, to haul the burden of serving our communities when it's not always easy? You're least staffed and least funded of any organizations, compared to for-profits. For-profits can't do it because they don't have the interest or desire. Governments are sometimes prohibited, from doing it because of church and state or organizations that may not be popular in kind of with our morals and the general population or whatever. And individuals, you can't rely on doing it because they may not. If I wanted to start well, Ayanna and I both are wearing pink. If we wanted to start a, pink women's organization to support women in pink and breast cancer, whatever, not everybody's going to be interested in that. Somebody may like blue and may like something else, and so individuals can help, but they're not going to be the ones that are doing it. So that's why I think churches and nonprofits continue to be so important. And if you look at the numbers, nonprofits, the cumulative nonprofits at the end of 2015, it's the last number I have from the Independence Center, nonprofits reached almost $3 trillion in assets based on the IRS's organizations of who they consider as nonprofits. And that's a low number because, as many of you know that I've mentioned before, and you probably already know, churches technically don't even have to file with the IRS for their 1023. If you qualify as a church in accordance with these 14 prongs that the IRS provides, I can provide some of that information, offline to those who want that. If you qualify as a church, you don't have to, as long as you comply with 501c3 rules, you don't have to actually file the document 1023 or 1023EZ to get status. Some churches will still do that because they like to have that determination letter. If somebody who wants to give money wants to see it. At the same time, churches are exempt from filing 990s. They have to adhere to the rules, but they don't have to file the 990s. So imagine a lot of churches out there that haven't filed information. So the $3 trillion number I give you is kind of a low ball, I think. Yeah, there's all these organizations that are out there that just haven't filed, or maybe not filed accurately. So if you look at all of that, it is becoming um, the kind of our Congress looks at it, and the regulation that's come with the 990, for example, which have become very complex in the past 3 years. It's becoming highly regulated, and it's becoming big business, if you will, the way that they're being treated and nonprofits are being treated. There's a lot of conversation about, should we tax the endowment of nonprofits? What about 1% tax? What about this? And there's this whole buzz about it. The thing to remember is since 1971, the collective giving of the American population to nonprofits has not gone over 2% of GDP. Think about that. So your nonprofit expenses have gone up, nonprofit, numbers numerically have gone up, but it hasn't been over 2% of GDP for 4 decades. So because of that, there's that constant push and pull. There's nonprofits need to act like businesses and corporations because that's where our government's kind of coming out. That's where some high donor level donors are, foundations are coming out. There are lots of large foundations, corporate and family foundations that give, but they're looking for corporate like behavior on one hand. On the other hand, you're still struggling with 2% of GDP in terms of giving, and your services continuing to rise and ratchet up. You're wider and deeper. So what kind of, I think where it comes down to me is it is in the best interest of the nonprofit organization and the nonprofit kind of scope of organizations to behave more like for profits from that corporate perspective. Go back to that coin, corporate perspective, tax perspective. Um, you're first and foremost a corporate entity. So let's make sure you can take the good things out of for profit corporate behavior. Most of your board members, most of your donors are going to be in the for profit sector. And they're going to bring that value when they evaluate their board engagement or their stewardship of the donor dollars. So I think it does behoove nonprofit organizations to look at the best behaviors, best practices of for-profit organizations, particularly startups and social enterprise. There's a lot of movement in that area right now. And the flip side of that coin is stay true to the mission at the same time. So there's something in between. So I don't know if you guys have read Jim Collins from Good to Great. Jim Collins wrote this book, highly touted in the Wall Street Journal, one of the bestsellers, and it was called From Good to Great. And it was really kind of a book about how to take your entity, your company from just good to great, literally that. And he has these great principles that business schools have studied all over the country, and our business school across the quad has studied it. But he did about 3 or 4 years ago a little primer, a shorter version on for the nonprofit sector specifically, and talks exactly about what we're talking about. Talks about there's so much good to gain from how for-profit businesses behave that we as not in the nonprofit sector should take, but also remember there are all these other things in terms of what's special to nonprofit sector, in terms of board governance, in terms of where the money's coming from and where the money's going, that's different. So let's make sure we adhere to those differences as well. So again, it's Jim Collins, From Good to Great for Nonprofit Sector. I think I'm looking forward in my office right now, but I think it's a pretty easy read. It's maybe 60, 70 pages at most. When I was board chair for an organization, I made sure every single person on the board had that and read it. And we spent a board training session, probably 30 minutes of that session, talking about how to incorporate some of those values into our board.
Mhm. That's helpful. It's funny. I just ran across that book too and wondered if it would be a good example. And that same author, I think, came back and wrote something else after the economic downturn
Yes.
that
Yeah.
about sort of how he thinks about this differently now.
Yes,
So
exactly.
yeah, I think that would be a helpful resource. We're winding down our time, everybody. But if there's one more question that we can take, I'd love to get it. So feel free to drop it on the chat. Um, in the meantime, I do want to thank you guys for coming, and I can see many of you here whose names I recognize, but even a few that I don't. So I'm so glad you were able to join us today. We got some board chairs, we got some board officers, we got a lot of EDs and founders and dreamers. So really glad to have you on here. Just want you to keep in mind for some of you, this is way ahead of where you are at right now, but that's good. Just file it away. Take the email Danny sent with the PDF of this and put it somewhere where you can come back to it and reference it. Because this is the kind of information you're going to want to remember that you learned. um, and be able to come back and reference that. At the by the same token, you want to come back and share this with the folks who weren't able to be on this webinar. So take it back to your organization, share it with those folks, and make sure that you pass this wisdom along. For those of you who are coming in September, you'll get to see Geetha there again. So we'll be so happy to have her with us. She's going to do basically the presentation that precedes this one that really lays the foundations for what it takes to start a nonprofit. So you'll get to experience that. I am seeing one more comment. The only time charitable GDP was more than 2% was during the Depression. When I worked for the United Way, we cursed the churches for taking 10%. Little did I.
Thank you. That is a good comment. Right. You're right. I love it. Well, thank you so much. I want to personally extend my thanks to the NBA team that's helped us do this. But more importantly, I just never cease to be amazed by all the passion, compassion, and the hard work that all of you have in serving our community. And I mean our community, because it's not just where you live, it's not just where I live, but our community is the whole world from my perspective. And so I really appreciate the work that you do to support that. And I know it's not easy, so I hope we can do something to help make it a little easier for you to do your good work.
Thank you so much, Geetha. There's more thanks messages coming across the wire. For the person who just asked about the Jim Collins book, you may have to dig a little to find it. I had to do the same. It's almost, if you go and find Good to Great on Amazon and you kind of scroll down to like books bought with this book, it may be a little easier to find it that way if you can't find it searching by yourself. But if you still need help, let me know. I'll email you a link to it because I'm pretty sure I've seen it already. So thank you, everybody, for signing in. Thanks, Danny, for supporting us. Thank you, Geetha, and many of us will see you soon.
See you soon. Thank you so much, everyone.
Okay.
Bye bye.
Bye.